The reason this is a very important session is for two reasons. One, our commitment to the Jerusalem Center for Foreign Affairs now is to have our internal consultation to inform our own writing, research, and presentation and communication in the media, as well as in our writing and publications, by having these intensive roundtables that are very collaborative intellectually and certainly in terms of moral clarity. What we're seeing, and I think that one of the things that has driven every single one of us in this room crazy, is to watch Unra used as basically a Hamas headquarters, run by the Hamas, directed by the Hamas, and exploited by the Hamas, even though much of the international, as a function of what they call milchama todati, cognitive warfare, political warfare, and I think that has sort of, since the 7th of October, has really focused a lot of the attention on the UN. The bad news is the UN, or maybe it's the good news because we're going to expose it in this. I think a lot of what Maurice, as an international attorney, and Alan Baker, who's advocate and ambassador Alan Baker, who has put together an extraordinary legal treatise called Israel Under Fire, Israel's Rights and Responsibilities as a Democratic State under terrorist attack, have given us really a repository of information, particularly on the PA-PLO and the Hamas, now the Hamas, which has really replaced the PLO and the PA as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian street, also by polling and also by statements coming out of, believe it or not, coming out of the West, as incredible as that is in many circles. The point of today's talk, and this is where I'm going to turn it over to Maurice, is that the UN is much worse than UNRWA has shown us. It's much worse. It started as, the UN started in the mid-late 1940s as a bastion of democracy, founded by and representing mostly democratic states. Today, it's become a cauldron and a paragon of subversion that is controlled by non-democratic powers, and that has actually legally and diplomatically empowered terror organizations like the PLO that began in the 1970s, which Maurice will show us about, through UN General Assembly resolutions beginning in the 1970s that actually distorted language, created diplomatic and legal foundations to allow terror groups to claim that they're really third world countries, Algeria and Cuba and Vietnam, under Chinese, first under Chinese and then under Soviet tutelage, before our very eyes. And the West, if I could be quoted, went to sleep. They went to sleep for 50 years. And they never thought it was that important. It could have been Western arrogance. We can play psychiatrist during our discussion. But they went to sleep. And before our very eyes today, we have, UN General Assembly Resolution 2708 of 1970 that fundamentally redefined the justification for acts of aggression by national liberation movements. That's where you have the notion that groups that claim to be under colonization or imperialism have the right to use terrorism against democratic states as a legal diplomatic response. So the headline here is, we really want to expose, educate, and engage on the malign behavior of the UN and begin to really hold them to account the way we began to do, and Maurice has been really head of the spear on this from in our organization, against this sort of halo effect that the UN somehow continues to have when it really is a malign actor. And Israel has to be, I think, a light unto the nations, first unto itself, and then unto the nations, about exposing the UN for what it is and holding them to account. So I'll introduce Maurice because he has some very interesting research to share about the UN, the PA, or it's really the PLO at the UN, and the malign relationship.
So, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dan, for the introduction. Thank you for coming. The subject of Israel and the UN is really it's really at least one doctoral theory, if not two or three or four. But I'm going to try and get through it in 25 slides, just to give a taste of what's going on, but starting from how we got there. And the understanding it being that once you're able to identify what exactly the problem with the UN is, then you can possibly start to understand how you can respond and react and possibly even neutralize all of those really malfeasance of the UN in its entirety. The start of the discussion is Abba Eben. Like, everybody knows the quote, they've understood the quote, and unfortunately nothing has changed. If Algeria introduced a resolution that said the world is flat and Israel flattened it, it would pass automatically with 164 in favor. That was before they became 199 states, and only 26 abstentions. Like, that's crazy in and of itself, because it's that understanding of what is the UN. We're talking about the UN General Assembly. It's just a collection of all the different countries. They vote according to bloc patterns. They vote according to, historically as well, you had the communist bloc, you had the Islamic Cooperation Group, you had the African countries all voting together, as Dan very clearly and correctly identified, voting together to present and promote a specific political ideology that wasn't meant to be in the UN. It was an entirely different story. This is the type of theory that then brings you to the question, so when has the UN ever made decisions in Israel's favor, right? So I believe that there's only really one day, possibly two, when you can identify that the UN actually did something positive for Israel, right? The two dates are up on the screen. The 24th of July 1922. So you'll say that's before the UN came about. You're right. It's the League of Nations. What happens with the League of Nations? 24th of July 1922. They adopt the mandate. The mandate not only provides the political, but also the legal basis for Israel's creation. It says then, we recognize the historical connection of the Jewish people to the place called Palestine and their right to reconstitute their national homeland. Like, you have to remember those things, because at the end of the discussion, they will become super relevant when you realize that this is part of a new revisionist theory of history in order to fit history and facts into, how did you define it, Ahuva? The new idea of international law based on convenient facts and facts that you just ignore. So we'll see that going on. The mandate from the League of Nations was then adopted when the League of Nations was disbanded and reconstituted as the UN, Article 80. And then the question mark as to whether the second date is actually a positive event or a negative event. The mandate provided that the entire area between, as the Palestinians say, between the river and the sea will be a Jewish homeland. Not a Palestinian state, not an Arab state, a Jewish homeland. That was the clear provision of the mandate. It talked about all of Palestine, it talked about obviously the other side, Transjordan as well, but specifically provided that the British could separate off Transjordan and give it to the Arabs there. And so that was the legal basis. So when you get to the 29th of November 1947, is that a positive development? That's obviously the petition plan. We're now deciding we're going to get together again as the General Assembly, and we're going to divide up this area that was given to the Jews. If the mandate created what was the quintessential two-state solution, Jews to the left, Arabs to the right, the petition plan then came along and said, we're going to revise that. We're going to create two Arab states, to the right entirely Arab, to the left, well, that'll be divided up between the Jews and the Arabs. It's something which really did try to detract from the rights of the Jewish people as provided by the mandate to sovereignty over that entire area. So I don't know if it's necessarily something which is positive, but it certainly did have that knock-on effect and then brought about the creation of the state of Israel. But I believe that it's erroneous to argue that either the partition plan, or even those who argue that the State of Israel was created, as the Palestinians argue, it was only created as a reaction to the Holocaust. Well, that's just not true, because the mandate was adopted 23 and 25 years previously. So it's no connection to, it's part, but that's part of that revisionist history. So let's just look at how then the UN became dominated by a group of countries or specific organization, which then implements this this theory. So how many UN organizations actually operate in Israel? That's the question of the moment. And I'm sure you'll all be amazed to hear that there are actually 22 different UN organizations that operate in Israel. Of them, 18 have a permanent presence, right? One of them just celebrated last year, their 75th anniversary, UNTSO, the UN Truce Supervision Organization, right? What truce are they supervising 5 years later? So you ask yourself that question and you realize, put it together with the date, they're celebrating the 75th anniversary of the 1949 armistice agreements, which have been breached multiple times, as every time the Arab countries tried to destroy Israel, and yet they're still in Israel. The organization still exists. And for what exact purpose? What exactly have they managed to avoid? What major wars did they manage to prevent? When did they ever prevent any of the Arab nations from the desire to destroy Israel? We all remember 1967, we were talking about it recently, with it's the Tkufat Hamtana, this waiting period that's possibly where we're experiencing now. In Egypt, they had no problem just throwing out all of the UN people from the Sinai, and that was really the start of that whole process of the 6 Day War. Like, and then in that same context, we all know of UN Resolution 3379, right? 3379, famous, infamous, whatever you want to call it. That's the resolution that equated Zionism to racism, because that's what the UN could do. But on the same day, you had that whole slew of different resolutions that were adopted, and I would suggest that the other resolutions, as nefarious as equating Zionism with racism is, the other resolutions are the ones which are doing us the most damage, and from them until this day, Zionism is racism has been repealed. The other resolutions have stayed in place, and they are the source of the danger. The next question is obviously, who invented the occupied Palestinian territories? That's a discussion that's going on in the International Criminal Court, in the International Court of Justice, and all. When did that even become a term? Between 1948 and 1967, did the UN adopt even one resolution calling on Egypt to deoccupy the Palestinian state in the Gaza Strip, or calling on Jordan to end the occupation of Judea and Samaria, of the West Bank? Zero decisions. Because that whole idea of an occupied Palestinian territory didn't exist until Israel took back what should have been ours from the start in 1967. And then they started discussing that, but it didn't start immediately. Unfortunately, it started predominantly, that use of the term, the occupied Palestinian territories, started predominantly and spread like wildfire, unfortunately, after the Oslo Accords. It's one of those incidental effects of the things that you don't necessarily expect to happen, but that's really what happens. So let's look at a few examples of the way the UN operates. So we have to start with these two basic resolutions that were both adopted on the same platform, and they are the source of I think much of the damage that's been done ever since. The first one, both of them were adopted on the same day, by the way. The first one calls for the invitation of the Palestine Liberation Organization to participate as the representative of the Palestinian people. You don't see that anywhere else. We have an organization which was involved in terrorism around the world being invited to join the UN as a representative of this people that are carrying out terrorism. That's their status until this day. That's the status that they keep on upgrading as they go along. They're the Palestinian state. They're the ones who requested the upgrade in 2012. They're the ones who requested the update, the upgrading of their status again now in the recognition of the state of Palestine. They see themselves as the motor driving everything towards the Palestinian state. But that, as bad as it may be, was nothing in compared to this. Resolution 3376 is, I believe, the source of most of the anti-Israel activity in the UN, possibly the source of most of, I would argue, most of the anti-Semitism and Israel hatred around the world, which I think is possibly a bold statement, but I'll explain why. What did this resolution create? It created the Committee for the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. What other similar committees do you have for other people who believe that they have independent rights, rights to self-defense? You don't see it. This is a committee that has been functioning ever since. If you follow the actions of this committee, you suddenly understand why everyone hates Israel. Literally like that. Every few days, it's not even every week, every few days, this committee puts out an entire mailing list, tens of thousands of people, if not more, a list of every single anti-Israel activity that's taking place all around the world. All of the NGOs who are feeding into that, all of the decisions that are being adopted by any committee around the world. And because it's a committee mandated and created by the UN, it means that it goes out to all of the UN members. It means that it goes out to the entire world in every language. It means that if you don't have the ability to answer what they are saying and to combat what they're saying, these emails come to any one of the bureaucrats in any one of these foreign offices around the world. They see this list of just how bad Israel is in all different languages from all different parts of the world. And if you're sitting there reading this information without the basic understanding of what is going on here, I believe that you too would hate Israel, would want the destruction of Israel, not only the creation of a Palestinian state, but really the destruction of Israel, because you see how all of the actions that Israel conducts are so prejudicial to basic, as they say, to basic foundations of humanity. And that's the mechanism that spreads this evil all around the world. So that's at the level of the UN, that you have this entire system focused on not only promoting Palestinian rights, but undermining Israel, that's now been working for 58 years, constantly undermining Israel at every single level, at every single turn. It's not even something that most of the countries, whilst if you remember, and I'll touch on it later, the decision of the US administrations and then later the Trump administration to try and deal with the Human Rights Council, no one has even thought about defunding this committee, disbanding this committee. That, I would suggest, as an action point moving forward, should be what should be promoted in any situation. This is a committee that is fundamentally evil to Israel and has to be passed up. And every country that funds the UN, including the US, is funding this committee. Unra. So let's talk about Unra. We're now going to talk about specific organizations that are functioning in Israel and their activities. I'm only going to give you, obviously, little tidbits of everything to talk about Unra. It's also possibly an entire doctoral thesis. One of the articles in Alan's compendium touches on Unra, written by Dr. Rafael Ben-Ari and Shaul, I forget his second name. I apologise. I'll remember in a second. And so you can read the material there. But Unra, just a few things. Firstly, UNRWA as an organization is devoted to the perpetuation of the lie that millions of Palestinians, they weren't called Palestinians then, they were called Palestine refugees. They've just casually adopted this term that they're Palestinians. When did they become Palestinians? No one really knows when they became Palestinians, because Golda Meir was also a Palestinian. She held a passport for Palestine because that was the definition. But they had the Palestinians will eventually, they all have the automatic right to return. They can all come back to Israel. That means we're talking about now some 6 million people. Imagine the effect of flooding Israel with another 6 million hostile Arabs. That would completely change the demography of Israel. And I argue that their goal is to change, to demographically and democratically destroy Israel, because that's the goal of UNRWA. UNRWA has no purpose whatsoever apart from that goal, other than perpetuating the refugee status. Now, one of the things about UNRWA, which is truly amazing, like truly amazing, for years and years and years, no one knew. You had this big number. How many refugees are there around the world? No one knew where they were, what ages they were, anything else like that. So UNRWA, just a few years ago, produced a population dashboard, they call it, right? If you go onto the population dashboard, you can see where the refugees are and their age group. So let's just have a look at some of this here, right? It's being a UNRWA refugee is a kamea to being for longevity. Why do I say that? Here we have the age structure, right? We have 549 people, 49,000 people who are 70 and above, right? So let's consider that. 76 is already the cutoff point, 77, 78. So anyone above that age was really 2, 3, 10 when they left Israel, ostensibly. Now, take into account that we're in a war-torn area that suffered constant civil wars, where sanitation wasn't necessarily the first order in any of these places. And yet, of the 711,000 original refugees, an exorbitant amount are still alive. So how do you get to that point? When you get further into the numbers, you realize that when you go through the entire dashboard, I didn't put it on the screen, but in this area here, you can look in the field, and it gives you a breakdown of where these refugees live, right? Where the 6 million Palestine refugees live, and the answer is one of 5 places: Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Gaza, or the West Bank. There are no Palestine refugees living anywhere else in the world. Well, we know that's not true, right? We know that that isn't the case. There are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Palestine refugees who left. With his permission, I famously quote that I have a friend here in Jerusalem who was born to a Jewish mother and an Arab father. He grew up in Kuwait, but then discovered he was Jewish and was chozer b'tshuva. He now lives in Jerusalem as a religious Jew, and he's an UNRWA registered refugee. Like, you can't get more absurd than that. But that's the case that happened, and you don't know where they haven't moved on anywhere. In Lebanon, for example, if you look at the dashboard, they say there's 450,000 refugees. Studies conducted already in 2010 said the number is no more than 110,000, 115,000. All the rest have left. All the rest have died. We don't know where they are. UNRWA provides no information whatsoever on how many people have died, how many people have gained other citizenship. As a general rule for a refugee, when you gain other citizenship, you lose your status as a refugee. Not with the Palestinian refugees and UNRWA, because that's the way that they work. So that's a little bit on UNRWA. You obviously have the UNRWA's complete assistance to Hamas all over, particularly in Gaza. The famous pictures of the Hamas computer server farm underneath UNRWA headquarters in Gaza, with electric cables going from the headquarters into the server farm. There were the reports of a few years ago of the car park in the Unra headquarters in Gaza suddenly sinking into the ground. And nobody could explain why that was happening. I wonder why. Like maybe because Hamas was building tunnels under your headquarters, you knew it, you saw it, and you turned a blind eye at best, or were party to those actions at worst. I would proffer that it's probably the last. But UNRWA is not the only problem. The second source of fundamental evil of these organizations is OCHA, the UN Organization for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. OCHA is the organization responsible for whitewashing, or as I say, UN washing, the fictitious Hamas numbers of the death toll in Gaza. So let's look at this just for a second of an example of things that appear on their website. On March 29, 2024, there were 32,623 alleged deaths in Gaza. A week later, the number had gone to 33,091. Those of you quick with math will already see that's a growth of 468 people. Great. So if you're looking at one report, it gives you a good number. If you're looking at the other report, it gives you a good number. It's growing all the time. But as the lawyers say, the details are in the small print. So let's look at a second at the small print. Over here on this number, of the 32,623 people who had been killed, at least 900 were women.
9,000.
At least 9,000 were women. And at least 13,000 were children. A week later, when the death toll has grown by 468, how many of them were women? So it appears that a week later, more than 9,500 were women. That means that of the 468 people killed, 500 were women. But it gets worse. Look at the children. 13,000 children on 1 week. Next week, 14,500. So of the 468 people killed in total, 2,000 were women and children. The problem with these numbers is that, A, they don't represent anything because they're all the source, as they say, is the Gaza Ministry of Health, Hamas. Hamas, the terrorists, are telling a story. The UN is whitewashing the numbers. They just adopt blindly the numbers that are being presented without any type of critical analysis. And then they present them as fact. And if you're not looking at these numbers in a critical way, every day you read the report, you see that the number's gone up. If you go into that report from the 5th of April and you don't compare it to the week before, you have no idea that they're just lying. That they're presenting a reality which doesn't exist, that is based on Hamas propaganda. And then you have the events of the 6th of May and the 8th of May. Obviously on the 6th of May, they have a report that goes out. Again, these reports go out to the entire world. The International Court of Justice, in its decision in February, already based itself on the numbers of OCHA. International Court of Justice, it's a branch of the UN. What the UN says is more holy than the Torah given to Moses by God, and therefore it becomes the reality. So already in January, the International Court of Justice, discussing the genocide claim, was talking about 25,700 deaths in the Gaza Strip. Right? Great number. That's what they claim, based on OCHA numbers. So here you have the 6th of May, this report that goes out to the entire world, tells the entire world that 34,735 people have been killed in Gaza without a hint of any type of question mark. Is it the actual number? Is it a different number? Has it been verified? Who's verified it? And so if you read the report on the 6th of May, that's what you get. 2 days later, they suddenly have an addition. Only 24,686 identified as of the 30th of April. Now, this might give you the impression that the UN, OCHA, actually went and checked, because they said, identified. We've identified them. But that's not true. Because how did that number come about? You have to understand that that was a number that was put out by Hamas a month earlier. And then they just simply adopted the Hamas new number. These are the identified people. Hamas explained that All of the additions were double reporting. They opened up a website that anyone could report on someone being killed. Whether they'd been killed or not, it wasn't clear. Even among those identified, this is how we know that we're living in the time of the Mashiach. Because some of those identified as dead in 2023, 2024 were already killed in 2014. So obviously they'd like come back to life as part of this whole process of redemption. Like, you can't explain these things apart from the fact that they're just inventing the numbers and they're just trying to fit them in with what's going on. That's OCHA. So we have the basic level of SERP, we have Unra, we have OCHA, the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council, we're not going to talk about it a lot, everyone has heard about it. This was the council that's set up ready to defend human rights. This is already its second incarnation. The first incarnation was destroyed in 2006 because it was fundamentally evil and fundamentally biased against Israel. It was recreated in 2006 from the Commission to the Council at the demand of the US administrations, and the result that we have today is no better. It's no better whatsoever. In fact, it's even worse, because now they are the reincarnated version and a much better version of what was, but really it's no different whatsoever. You have Agenda Item 7. Agenda Item 7, as many of you know, by profession I was a prosecutor in the army. I've stood in, obviously before the disengagement in 2005, I had a crazy experience to be standing in courtrooms in the Gaza Strip with these crazy Hamas terrorists. They're all around you. There's like 15 of them. They're all part of the different terrorist groups. They're all murderers. And you're standing there as a prosecutor. It's not like the IDF soldiers who go out and nobody sees their faces. You're a prosecutor. Your name is on the protocol of the hearing. And you're saying, j'accuse. You're saying, you're a terrorist. I'm going to send you to jail. That is a frightening experience, I have to say. Because there's like 3.5 other soldiers in the room with you and the judges. They're behind a bench and you're just there with the families of the terrorists. Quite a hairy experience. It was nothing compared to a speech that I gave in the UN Human Rights Council. You're standing there. There are only 3 or 4 organizations that are ECOSOC accredited, alongside 75 different Palestinian or pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel. They're not anti-Israel, not only pro-Palestinian organizations that are giving their speeches. It's just a hate fest, and you're the little Jew in the room with your kippah on your head, and you can just feel this antagonism and this hatred when you open your mouth. Agenda Item 7, it's meant to be one of these things that the US administration has in law, that we will not fund anything that is connected to the Human Rights Council unless they are actively showing that they are reducing, what is Agenda Item 7 for those who don't know? It's the specific agenda item devoted only to Israel. There's a general discussion subject of crises around the world, breaches of human rights around the world, and then there's Israel. Agenda Item 7 is devoted only to the Jewish country and the assault on the Jewish country. That still exists, and it's hate fest twice, sometimes 3 times a year. One of those terrible things. They then set up all these commissions of inquiry. We have now Navi Pillay and her merry band of Jew haters running around. These are people who you cannot even understand some of the things that they write. Their recent report discussed what happened on the 7th of October. They have a whole section on trying to present that fig leaf and present their credentials as neutral on what happened on the 7th of October. And it includes a whole section on sexual violence. Their argument is, we don't know if sexual violence really happened, because Israel won't allow us access to the victims, and the victims won't cooperate with us. Well, maybe that's because your 3 previous reports were so full of anti-Semitism and Jew hatred that you've lost any type of credibility, and therefore no one is ever going to talk to you. And the only thing that they present there is the one-sided view of what happened. Of, well, Hamas denied that we committed sexual offences. We find a problem with that, but seeing as we don't really have any evidence, we have nothing really that we can say. And similar nefarious comments that they make all the way through. The offensive part of this committee is that it's funded by, again, the whole UN mechanism. It has a mandate which already identifies the Jew as guilty, and now all you have to do is fill in the blanks around it. All alleged violations of international humanitarian law and alleged violations of abuses leading up to and April 13, 2021, and the instability and including the systematic discrimination and repression based on national and ethnic and religious origin. You've already decided that the Jews are responsible for every type of racist crime, and now let's just fill in the blanks. This is a never-ending mandate. It doesn't have a time limit. They write reports frequently for every session of the Human Rights Council. There's another report that comes out. This is adding to this bulk of Human Rights Council reports that entirely distort the context, the situation, the history, the reality on the ground, and vilify the Jews simply because they can. And it's funded by the entire UN mechanism. That means employees, that means people traveling around the world, that means Navi Pillay and her co-conspirators, that means that entire mechanism of Arabic speakers, of Hebrew speakers, of translating everything. This is a huge mechanism devoted entirely to blackening Israel. Let's not forget the special rapporteur, Albanese, Francesca Albanese, who is just an open anti-Semite. Just an open anti-Semite. But then you have the things that she says, which are just along the way in one of the updates on her reports and her findings. She said this year, she was talking about 2023, before the massacre. This year, actually, since the beginning of my mandate, May 21, I have borne witness to a series of deeply distressing events. 420,000 Palestinians, including 91 children, have been killed. Say what? Excuse my equivalent. Where do you find these 420,000 people that have been in the period of her mandate? That's just an outright lie. She said this, and unfortunately, the UN mechanisms are so distorted, so fundamentally biased. That speech was given as part of a presentation to the Human Rights Council. It's still on YouTube. She later corrected and said, no, I didn't mean that. I meant 468. Why 468? Don't know why. How does that connect to 420,000? Don't know. But if you want to look at Francesca Albanese's speech on YouTube in the Human Rights Council, that's the number that you get. There's no asterisk that says, oh, by the way, she was lying. By the way, she corrected it afterwards. By the way, this was just an anti-Semitic rant. It's there on YouTube for everybody to see. This is the woman that, as a UN rapporteur, has now invented the hashtag of delist Israel. Get rid of Israel from the UN. This is her push all the way through. It adds to a number of other different comments that basically Israel is responsible for its own massacre because we are oppressing the Palestinians.
Where is she situated physically?
She travels around the world, Dan. She travels around the world. She's connected to the Human Rights Council, to the High Commissioner. That's part of her mandate as a special rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories. There are all types of questions regarding exactly what she's doing, how she's doing, where she's getting funding. Our friends at UN Watch are following her closely and have submitted a number of complaints also on the subject of funding and all types of irregularities. We'll leave it there for them, but she's definitely high up there. But she has this entire UN platform to run around the world with her credentials as the special rapporteur saying, well, Israel is evil. Not only is Israel evil and oppressing the Palestinians, Israel needs to be thrown out of the UN. Like China's murdering the Uyghurs, it doesn't matter. Assad butchered 400, 500,000 of his own people, chemical weapons, it doesn't matter. The Iranians hang homosexuals from cranes, it doesn't matter. Who needs to be thrown out of the UN? According to Albanese, only Israel. Doesn't matter. Sudan, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what's going on around the world. How many people are dying? The only country singled out by Albanese is Israel. Daniel? I would like to say it's the end, but it's not. UNICEF. UNICEF is one of my, obviously my particular pet hates. I would say pet hates. I started my position as the head of the prosecution for Judea and Samaria on the 1st of March 2013. 6 days later, UNICEF puts out a report. This is the report: Children in Israeli military detention. In that report, they say like this: the ill treatment of children appears to be, unfortunately that's the mistake in the original. Ill treatment of children appears to be widespread, systematic and institutionalized. Now what are they talking about? They were talking about the arrest and prosecution of minors, Palestinian minors in Judea and Samaria in the military courts. Now you can have that as a finding. They had 38 different recommendations that they said have to be fulfilled or otherwise Israel would remain an abuser. And most of the time, most people will read the report. This is a terrible report. What Israel is doing to these poor little Palestinian children is absolutely terrible. When I read the report, I'm now the head of the prosecution. Like, they're talking about me. They're talking about my job, my position. And when you suddenly read these words, the ill treatment of children appears to be widespread, systematic and institutionalized, most lawyers, and definitely the international lawyers, definitely international criminal lawyers, their little ears will start ringing. What is that connection of those three words? What does it mean? And to understand that, you have to go to the Rome Statute, ICC, and where you understand that an attack on a civilian population, which includes the deprivation of liberty, i.e. arrest, that is widespread, systematic and institutionalized, is nothing short of a war crime. It's one of those things that you have to understand the severity. Never mind the other things that they wrote there. After the report was written, I persuaded both the IDF MAG, then the IDF, and then the Foreign Ministry to allow me to engage with UNICEF, to hold discussions with them. Let's talk about your report. Let me show you how what you wrote is simply wrong. We had a whole long process that we then engaged in. They put up update reports. In some of the cases, they reluctantly admitted that what they had written wasn't relevant whatsoever. But obviously in UN language, never admitting that they'd made a mistake, because it's a UN organization. How could they make a mistake? And that process continued on for a year and a half. Yoaz Hindel, who was then Prime Minister Netanyahu's communications advisor, wrote an article after the last update saying that this is the most positive UN report that's ever come out about Israel. So the updates, because it took really the whole air out of the tires of the report. They practically recanted, but without saying that they recanted. But that report, similar to Francesca Albanese's presentation, still appears on the UN sites. If you don't know that there was a process of engagement that was conducted afterwards, you don't see it. Then you have, I won't use the term that I wanted to use, but you all know all types of what other people have termed as useful idiots, who then adopt these claims against Israel and then turn them into suggested legislation. For example, in the US, where a bill was submitted by a group of politicians there, who suggested that all aid US aid to Israel should be conditioned on dismantling this system of institutionalized, systematic and widespread abuse of the Palestinian children. So let's just see what we're talking about. This is what we're talking about, right? Ari Fold, I don't know if who of you knew Ari Fold, a friend who was murdered doing shopping 3 days before Yom Kippur, 2018. He was murdered by a Palestinian minor. According to UNICEF, the arrest, prosecution of that minor is a war crime, right? So you have Auschwitz on the one hand, the gas chambers, and prosecuting a minor who murdered an innocent Jew on the same footing. They're both war crimes. That is the perversion of the UNICEF report. UNICEF, I met with them here as well. They have an office here in Israel. They're one of those 22 organizations that sit here in Israel. They employ all types of interesting characters and also are connected to all types of interesting groups. One of the groups that works very, very closely with UNICEF is the PFLP, that has a number of different NGOs that they created in order to present this facade of legitimacy. But really, the PFLP, for all intents and purposes, one of them is Defense Against the Child Palestine, which Defense Against the Child, everybody wants to look after children, right? But not them. They are PFLP through and through. They were one of the organizations that were designated as a terrorist organization by Benny Gantz a few years ago as part of that PFLP network after the murder of Rina Schnerb. And that's clear. The background of the UNICEF report is that UNICEF in Israel, or the UNICEF for the occupied Palestinian territories, commissioned a survey, a research, to be done by DCI Palestine. DCI Palestine then did the research. UNICEF paid them to write a report and present the report. UNICEF then adopted, some would say even plagiarized, the DCI Palestine report with all of its mistakes entail, and then presented it as their own. The same UN whitewashing of terror propaganda that we see in Gaza today has existed for a long time. Now, this woman, like, nobody knows who she is. No one cares who she is. Her name is Jean Goff. Like, why would you care? Jean Goff was the UNICEF representative in Israel/Palestine in 2009 through 2013, i.e., the period where UNICEF joined hands with a terrorist organization in order to fund, promote, adopt, whitewash, plagiarize a false report, and then present that to the world. She then left. About 3 months ago, Jean Goff was again appointed as the UNICEF representative in Israel-Palestine. Shortly afterwards, coincidence maybe, I would argue not, Israel was suddenly blacklisted by the UN Secretary General as one of these countries in his yearly blacklist of countries that, or organizations that are breaching the rights of children in armed conflict. Is there a connection between the two? Without question, yes. Because Secretary General, as much as he hates Israel in his own right, he bases himself on reports from UNICEF. UNICEF has this pattern of helping the terrorists to whitewash their material in order to blacken Israel. And there you have UNICEF reports. They continue on with this process. When I ended the process in 2015 with UNICEF, my recommendation then to the Foreign Ministry, which unfortunately fell on deaf ears, was that UNICEF, as much as they've recanted or mitigated some of the original recommendations, UNICEF is an organization that fundamentally breaches any type of UN neutrality, and Israel should reconsider allowing them to function here. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. UNICEF carried on. They continued doing business with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and so we get to that situation. Guterres and that whole system of blacklisting Israel. That was one of the fundamentals that Israel has been fighting for a very long time. How does he get to the blacklist? Because you have the UN reports that are saying that how many children have died? We don't really know. Like if you go back, I apologise that I'm going backwards, I specifically didn't note it then. How many children have actually died? Remember, it was more than 14,500 people. Suddenly, when you read the small print, the number of women who had suddenly died went down drastically, almost by half. The number of children was almost halved. But when Guterres makes his designation and decides that Israel is a serial breacher of children's rights in armed conflict, that Israel is specifically targeting children, he goes on the OCHA number. Israel has killed 14,500 people. How many children? How many of them identified? Don't know. We don't let the small print bother us. And it's part of that entire. I worked for a while also with NGO Monitor, and there they have an entire report on this whole UN UNICEF network of organizations that feed into this annual reporting with the sole goal of having Israel blacklisted, have Israel put on the same footing as ISIS, as Boko Haram. These are the organizations that are in the blacklist, and Israel. It's part of that fundamental idea of delegitimizing Israel that has gone all the way through. Now, when does this all start? We saw it in 1974-75. It follows the Yom Kippur War. It follows the idea that we can't, I bring it up because it's at least 2 weeks ago, it was Parashat HaShavua, but it's this idea of we've come to the understanding, the Soviet bloc, the Arab bloc, part of the African bloc, we've come to the understanding that militarily we won't be able to destroy Israel. We tried in 48, it didn't work. We tried again in 56 trying to close the Straits of Tiran. It didn't work. We tried again in 67, it didn't work. We tried again in 73. So let's now change course. It goes together with the Arab oil boycott. It goes together with the change of that global war between communism on the one side and Western civilization on the other side. And it's all influenced through the UN and its decisions on the ground at the time. You're seeing this, really, it's the balance of power between the West, capitalism, I would say, or for fear of that, and communism on the other side. And it's playing out in the UN, but they have an automatic majority. And so the Western countries, the Western civilization automatically loses, and it comes up into the actions of the UN. The last two, obviously, are, for those that don't recognize the symbols, on the left, the International Court of Justice. This is the court which in 2004, on its opinion about the war, advisory opinion on the war, stated very clearly that Israel does not have a right to self-defense against genocidal terrorists. That's an easy discussion. Of course, why would Israel have the right to defend itself? Why would it have the right to present and to implement security provisions in order to stop walking bombs and coming into every restaurant, going into every bus and going into every mall and blowing themselves up to murder as many Jews as possible? But Israel doesn't have the right to self-defense. They carry on with those activities. We're seeing now the ICJ just recently had two very main roles in this program of delegitimizing Israel. Firstly, the petition of South Africa. It's not really South Africa, it's Iran, it's that same bloc, it's the PLO, it's Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority, pushing South Africa, another bunch of useful idiots, I would argue, to claim that Israel is carrying out a genocide in Gaza. They don't even know what the word means. They can't provide any evidence that this is what's going on. And yet, because the court automatically has to then deal with these claims, they're now looking at, well, what interim measures shall we put out in order to prevent Israel from carrying out this genocide? To give a basis for these interim measures, what do? They look at the numbers provided by OCHA. You have this really evil circle that just goes around and around and around, that Hamas puts out propaganda. It's adopted by OCHA, whitewashed by OCHA, pushed by Iran, pushed by the Palestinian Authority, adopted by South Africa, and there you have this process. And this process plays out in the International Criminal Court of Justice. At the same time, they've been asked by the UN General Assembly to provide an advisory opinion on the illegal effects of the on the legal implications of the illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories. The mandate, that the question that they've asked is pejorative to start with, and the result was the decision that they gave just 2 weeks ago. The decision written by and pushed really forward by the president of the court. So you're talking about the International Court of Justice. Most people looking around say, International Court of Justice, it sounds so legitimate. It sounds like it's a serious court. It's a court of justice. Like, that's what happens here. You see justice happening. So here's an example of the justice in the International Criminal Court of Justice. The court is now headed by Nawaf Salam, Judge Nawaf Salam. Judge Nawaf Salam is Lebanese origin, was a Lebanese diplomat for many years in the UN, where he spouted his Israel hatred. He's run twice for the position of president in Lebanon. Lebanon, for those who don't know, is at war now with Israel. So you have a country who's at war with Israel, have their own little judge in the International Court of Justice, who's deciding what to do with the evil Jews. That's the situation now. There's actually you would think, well, how can that be? Obviously, it's a court of justice. One of the elementary things of any court of justice is if you have any type of conflict of interest, the judge would recuse himself. Unfortunately, they don't have that type of a provision in the statute of the ICJ. But that's wrong. Of course they do. Of course they have a provision which says that if you're a judge who's involved in any type of conflict of interest, you have to recuse yourself. Does he? Absolutely not.
Didn't we ask for that?
Unfortunately, Israel didn't even ask for that. We didn't even say that this has to be a fundamental prerequisite for any. We have to here we have to distinguish, Alan, as you well know, but I'll explain for everyone else. Between the two proceedings that are going on in the ICJ, they are technically completely separate. One is in its function as the advisor, overall advisor to the UN and a functionary of the UN, and the other as its function as part of the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Two entirely different functions, but it's the same people. So where would you see in one case you have information being piled in? There's no rules of evidence really that are implemented there. Anyone can throw in any type of evidence. You have UN reports which are part of the evidence. They then influence what all of these judges are thinking and saying, and their mindset. How can you just ignore one and not see the other? But that's the inherent contradiction that you have there. And so as part of the genocide proceedings, Israel, once Nawaf Salam was appointed as the president of the court, should have first and foremost said, until you recuse yourself from this case, even though we have already agreed to the jurisdiction of the court as part of joining the convention, we refuse to participate in any more of these hearings. Unfortunately, we didn't do that. We agreed, albeit tacitly, passively, to continue on with this farce in front of a judge that is fundamentally biased against Israel, without standing up, and that's really Alan's project and an idea, without standing up for our basic rights. We have, as a party in the court, fundamental and basic rights which the court has to accept. And yet they're not, and we sometimes have a difficulty in and of ourselves standing up for our own rights. The ICC is something that we all know what's going on there. This is a court that Alan was heavily involved in drafting the statute, coming up with the statute. That the Jews were the forefront of the idea of creating an independent international court that would deal with the most severe of crimes that happen around the world. This was a great idea until it's that same party of nations that join in, that they then distort the basic statute of the ICC to turn it into something which can be used against Israel. And then Israel is forced to say, as with other countries, predominantly the US, to say, we can no longer agree to join the court. Israel never joined the court. To join the court, you have to be a state. Join the court, you have to be a state that held criminal jurisdiction that you can then delegate to the ICC. That's the way that the court works. So what are we doing with the ICC? Israel isn't a state. Is a state. We didn't agree to join. What other state exists that could possibly bring us before the ICC? And the answer is the state of Palestine. But then you ask yourself, where is the state of Palestine? We don't really know. It's that same organization. Remember, in 1975, we're going to invite the PLO to join as a member, and then we're going to upgrade its status in 2012 to a non-member observer state. The only other entity that holds that same status is the Vatican. So it's the Vatican on the one hand, and genocidal terrorists on the other. If I was the Vatican, I would be offended. But that's the situation they have. And then Palestine asks to join the International Court of Justice. They present their credentials and they say, we've now been accepted as a state. We asked the court to use its jurisdiction starting on the 13th of June 2014. That's a random date. Why would you start on the 13th of June 2014? But you have to understand, this is the end, Dan, you have to understand what it means, what that date is. On the 12th of June 2014, Palestinian terrorists kidnapped and murdered 3 teens in Gush Etzion, Israeli teens. That then started a whole knock-on effect, which eventually became Tzuk I forget the English word. Operation what?
Cast lead.
Cast lead was... That was a Oferat Yitzchak. Anyway, Tzuk Eitan in 2014 in Gaza, and there was the whole. But if the Palestinians can come and manipulate the reality to say we only want the court's jurisdiction to start on the day after the murder, then you cut off any type of context. On the 13th, all these Jews are just going crazy for no reason and murdering all these Palestinians. And that's the reality you can present. What does the court say? Oh, okay. And so just in the last few days, Alan and myself for the JCPA presented our arguments on this is a whole situation which has been going on. Alan and I have written previously on the original request of the prosecutor to define the geographical borders of the state of Palestine. The prosecutor had a problem in 2020. She said, well, you've created this state of Palestine, but I don't know where it is. So really what the court did and what she did and what the court accepted was that we're going to invent the state of Palestine. We're going to take a jurisdiction which we don't have to set the borders of the state of Palestine. And then we're going to find that any crime that was committed in those borders is a crime that can be brought before the court. Now, the court answers, well, obviously you can't say that because there's a border dispute, we have no jurisdiction. I understand that. Border dispute doesn't negate but there's no borders whatsoever. This country of Palestine never existed. You're inventing de novo something that didn't exist and you're defining its borders. That was never the jurisdiction of the ICC. And they've carried on. And now they're trying to issue arrest warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu and against the Minister of Defense Gallant. And so the observations, the submission that we made just in the last few days is going back to the basics. The Palestinian entity, it doesn't matter what the UN General Assembly wants to call it. The Palestinian entity is the Palestinian Authority. It was created by the Oslo Accords. In the Oslo Accords, there are numerous, repeated, over-repeated statements denying the Palestinian Authority any type of jurisdiction over Israelis. Imagine if they had jurisdiction. Every Israeli would be in court for being an illegal settler. It's not just from the point of view of the Palestinian settlers aren't people who live in Judea and Samaria. It's every Jew who lives in Israel. That's a settler. And they will all be prosecuted. One of their crimes, obviously, is selling land to Jews, which is a crime punishable by a life sentence with hard labor. Right? So imagine if they did have jurisdiction, what they would do. But so the Oslo Accord specifically said, you will not have any jurisdiction over Jews. There's provisions specifically in the legal annex which say you can't even arrest Jews, even if they came in and committed heinous offences. You can hold them on the spot and call an Israeli soldier. Nothing more than that. And yet the court has invented Palestine, set its borders, and has now decided that this imaginary state had criminal jurisdiction over Israelis that they could then delegate to the court. These are some of the anomalies of these UN and UN. The ICC, it has to be said, isn't a UN organization. Officially, it's meant to be independent, but it is heavily connected to the UN. The UN Secretary General is the depository of their own statute and of every country that wants to join. So you can't make that disconnect between them. So instead of kvetching and just saying shmum, which is what really Israel has done for the last 75 years since David Ben Gurion coined that phrase, we actually the suggestions that we have to I think promote are actual practical steps. We have to first examine what are these UN organizations that exist and operate in Israel, why are they here, and to what level are they evil, and based on that then decide whether they can or cannot stay in Israel. With OCHA, for example, the head of OCHA at the start of the war was a woman called Lynn Hastings. After a month and a half and her virulent Jew hatred, Israel decided to deny an extension of her visa. She was replaced by another guy who was no better, and just a few days ago it was announced that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had also decided to discontinue his visa. That should be a process adopted, an analysis done of each one of the organizations, see what they're doing, how they're acting. If they are breaching their duty of neutrality, they should be evicted from Israel. We should. The UNTSO has certainly outlived any type of relevance. When we're looking at Almona Naziv, thank you, Alan, for the addition to the presentation. This is one of these areas that Israel should immediately order their evacuation by the UN personnel there and be taken back. The Unra site in Givat Moshed and Munich Hill has been built on land which isn't UN land. There's unlimited illegal construction, including a gas station that they set up in the site, which breaches every type of safety law in the country. There have been demolition orders issued against it, but politics, it's not happening yet. But that's something that should be done. What is Israel doing in the Human Rights Council? This organization is it's not a human rights council, it's a council dominated by the worst human rights abusers in the world, that is simply a source of additional Israel hatred. Every couple of months, that's the scene. Israel should not, I would argue, should not be party to any type of connection to the human rights organization, not step foot in that organization, in those buildings, in those proceedings. I know that sometimes there's the argument, well, if we're there, we can possibly influence what's going on. Unfortunately, we're 75 years down the line. We haven't been able to influence anything that's going on there. And therefore, maybe we have to come to the conclusion that we just have nothing to do there, and therefore should leave. Leaving the UN. The entire organization is widespread, systematic and institutionalized attacking of Israel. And so should we still be there? Israel was the 51st, I think, state to join the UN after it was reconstituted. We are one of the oldest members of the UN, and yet we are there. I don't mean to say this lightly, but it's almost as if we are suffering from battered woman syndrome. That's what happens in the UN. We know every single day that we go in, we are going to be beaten, we are going to come out with black eyes, we're going to be thrown down the stairs, we are going to be vilified, and yet every day we go back for the same punishment. At some stage we have to think to ourselves, does the benefit of being part of the UN, whatever benefit there may be, outweigh the damage that it's constantly doing to us? And do we need to be there? Is that the source of our legitimacy, of Israel's legitimacy as a country? Absolutely not. And therefore it has to be considered. Obviously, there's heavy arguments on the other side. We have to be there. We have a right to be there. And why should we be pushed out? So that's something that has to be considered. But it has to be a discussion which is held, which is thought about. Sometimes you even if you're going to come to the conclusion that we stay, it's something that has to be, I would argue, discussed. That's the UN mechanisms. That's unfortunately the situation that we found ourselves in. A very large organization, probably the largest in the world, that is directed and really functions as probably the most anti-Semitic organization in the world, that nobody is willing to admit that that's their real face. Thank you. Thank you very much.